Paul Hackett, an ordinary office worker living in New York, used to the monotony of everyday life, is finishing another boring day. His life seems to him a closed circle of work, home, rare outings to cafes or for walks. This evening, tired of routine, he decides to spend his time differently. A visit to a cozy cafe in Manhattan becomes for him a small breath of freedom from the everyday grayness. There, his attention is drawn to a woman who stands out for her striking appearance and relaxed manner of communication. She introduces herself as Marcy Franklin, and soon their conversation becomes animated. Paul immediately senses that Marcy is different from everyone else and that there is something special, almost magical about her. During the conversation, Marcy tells him that she lives in SoHo with her friend Kiki Bridges, a sculptor who creates unusual works. Marcy describes how Kiki sculpts papier presses in the shape of bagels with melted cheese. Paul thinks it's a joke at first, but Marcy claims that Kiki sells them and they are a success. Marcy leaves Paul her phone number and walks away, leaving behind a certain sense of mystery and mystery. Paul thinks long and hard about whether he should take this opportunity. His ordinary life does not often present such chances, and finally he decides to call. The conversation on the phone is short but intriguing. Marcy invites Paul to her place, and he overcomes his doubts and sets off. The taxi rushes through the evening New York, but an unexpected incident throws Paul off balance. As he hands a $20 note to the driver, a sharp gust of wind snatches it from his hands and blows it away through the open window. Paul is left with the change, and the driver, grumbling unhappily, still agrees to drive him. This loss seems like a small thing, but soon becomes a symbol of his night full of absurdities and accidents. When Paul arrives in SoHo, the neighborhood immediately makes a strange impression on him. It looks both appealing and frightening at the same time. Dim streetlights, dusty gallery windows, and small nooks and crannies create an atmosphere of mystery. Going up to Marcy's flat, the first thing Paul meets is her friend Kiki. Kiki is busy working on a strange sculpture of a man screaming. Paul notices that the work reminds him of the famous painting Scream. He tries to compliment her, but Kiki responds dryly, as if she is not interested in his comments. There are art objects scattered everywhere in the flat, some of which look frightening. Marcy appears and the atmosphere changes. She greets Paul cheerfully, but there is something strange in her behavior. She starts talking about her hobbies, her life in SoHo, her friends' oddities. Paul tries to make light conversation, but at some point he notices that Marcy is becoming more and more mysterious. He notices the medicines and ointments on the shelf and guesses that they are for treating burns. This discovery raises many questions for him, but he hesitates to ask them. In his mind, he gradually forms an image of Marcy as a woman with a traumatic past, but her lightness and charm confuse him. The conversation takes an increasingly strange turn. Marcy jokes and then suddenly becomes serious as she recounts episodes of her life. Paul feels out of place, but his politeness and desire to understand what is going on make him stay. At one point, he even wonders if this is really a date or if he's in the middle of some absurd theater. When the tension reaches a peak, Paul decides to leave. He apologizes and leaves the flat, intending to return home, but that's when his real adventure begins. On the street, Paul faces his first problem. He has almost no money left. He realizes he can't afford a taxi and is forced to find other ways to get home. As he wanders the streets of SoHo, he notices that the neighborhood is becoming increasingly spooky. His attention is drawn to strange passersby whose gazes seem too intense for him. He walks into the nearest cafe to try to find help. The waiter offers him a cup of coffee, but Paul realizes that it will cost him his last coins. After a brief conversation with the waiter, he leaves the cafe feeling even more alone. The next stage of his night is meeting a woman named Julie who works at the bar. She seems friendly and offers to let Paul rest until he can find a way out. However, even here he is unable to relax. The conversation with Julie soon takes a strange turn, and Paul feels that she is more interested in his plight than wanting to help. Paul leaves, but on the way he encounters a couple of eccentric artists who mistake him for a thief. He is forced to flee, hiding in narrow alleys. Each encounter with new people turns his night into a real nightmare. At one point, he finds himself in the flat of a woman named Gail, who promises to help him. However, her manner of communication alarms Paul. She begins to speak in riddles and hints that he is part of a plan. But Paul does not understand what she is talking about. The situation escalates when Gail suddenly disappears, leaving Paul alone in the flat. The night culminates in a chase that involves a whole crowd of SoHo residents. Someone spreads a rumor that Paul is a thief who has committed a series of burglaries. The crowd pursues him, and Paul is forced to flee again, finding hiding places in the most unexpected places. He ends up at Kiki's workshop, where he hopes to find help, but instead encounters more chaos. Kiki and Marcy act as if his return was expected, and hint that his appearance here is part of some kind of game. When morning comes, Paul manages to escape this strange and frightening world. He returns to his workplace, exhausted and mentally drained. However, as he sits at his desk, he begins to realize that his familiar, predictable life has its perks. Everything that has happened during that night seems both real and surreal to him, as if he has experienced something beyond ordinary comprehension.